Welcome to SSI Meetup. Today we will have the second DID report directly coming from Drummond Reed and Markus Sabadello, who were there directly live in the face-to-face meeting in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, at the Microsoft offices in Schiphol at the airport. And they will share with us everything that was happening in the second meeting. We had a similar report recently in October 2019 from the meeting that took place in Japan. And this is the second one, which took place in the Netherlands. And as you know, DIDs are one of the key components of SSI, and Markus Sabadello and Drummond Reed are two of the key global thought leaders on the subject. Today, we're having the DID marathon, so this means that we will have first this session, which will take about 1 hour, where Markus and Drummond will share everything that happened in the Netherlands. And then we have another session in 2 hours, starting in 2 hours, which will be about the DID chapter that Markus and Drummond have written for the Self-Sovereign Identity book that will be published this summer. And this is really, really exciting. I think Markus and Drummond have created some of the best content I've seen in explaining DIDs. I really wonder if most people have gone so deep in explaining DIDs. And they will do this presentation to give some insights about what that means, what they have been writing about in that chapter for the Self-Sovereign Identity book that we will be publishing with Manning. So if you're still in the mood and have the energy, please follow that session too. This session now will be about what happened in the Netherlands last week, and then in 2 hours we will start with the other session. So having said all this is the intro. Quickly, we're going to review in the next slide what SSI Meetup is about. And for those guys that don't know us yet, this is basically something to empower global SSI communities all over the world. And open global SSI communities just means if you're a company, an individual, like a government, an association, it doesn't really matter. This is open for everyone, and we try to give coverage to everything that is happening in the very fast-growing SSI space. We share all this content with the Creative Commons by Share license, which means that you can reuse the material. You will have the link to the Go slide deck of what will be shared today, and as we did for all the other sessions before, you will have access to the video, and you will have access to slide share and presentation. And this will allow you, hopefully, to use this material to create your own local meetups, which is why we are called SSI Meetup, and just talk about this and keep on growing the old ideas about SSI, which is what this is about. If you have any questions during the presentation, please bring them up using the question tool. Markus and Drummond will be happy to answer any of those. We have exactly 60 minutes sharp, like now it's 55 minutes sharp, because they have some other little things they have to tend to after this webinar, and then they will be joining us in 2 hours. Yeah, if you use this material, please give credit back to SSI Meetup and to Drummond and Markus. As always, if this is the first time, please actively use this opportunity to talk to these world experts on this subject, as we always have, because I really think it's a privilege for me, for everyone to be able to do that. And without further ado, thank you so much, Drummond and Markus, for being with us here today. And Drummond will be leading, together with Markus, the session now and tell us what happened last week in the Netherlands.
And we're very happy to be here again, Alex, for our second copy of the DID report. With Markus, we just spent a week together in beautiful Amsterdam. And I don't know, Markus, what did you think of that whole experience?
It was fantastic to be there and meet everyone in person, right? We have weekly calls to work on dates and the date specification, but a call is not the same as a face-to-face meeting. So to get in a room with all the people who you're working with is just so much more productive and fun. And I remember the initial DID report that we did a few months ago. Still remember it as if it was yesterday, and I'm happy now to be doing part 2.
And one thing we both remember about that report is that since it was right after the meeting we had in Fukuoka, Japan, we both just made international trips. We went on for 2 hours. It was quite a long report with a lot of background, and we didn't self-edit very much. We're going to be more concise with this report here because both of us have other obligations we've got to take care of in the next hour, and I think that's going to be plenty of time to really get to the meat of what we covered, which was a lot, but I think we'll be able to summarize it pretty well. you've got all our background here on this slide, and so let's just dive right into it. Now, we just, in case you're new to DIDs, decentralized identifiers, we do have just a handful of background slides here to make sure that you have some context. This is work that began 4 years ago, and we're both very involved in the very first draft, and then was contributed to the credentials community group at W3C. And after almost 2 years of incubation there, the W3C said, this is a new identifier standard we need to get behind, and they voted to form a full working group. And that's the address if you want to go read about the working group. That it's co-chaired by Dan Burnett from Consensus, Brent Zundell from Evernym. There are 3 editors on the spec, Markus, myself, and Manu Smorty from Digital Bazaar, and we're up to 80 participants from 29 member organizations. I just did a new count this morning. This is only a handful of the ones that could fit here on this slide. And I think we had about, 30 people attend in person, Markus? Was that about right? In Amsterdam?
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Yeah, so it wasn't, it wasn't the full set that participated on the calls, but it was a very nice majority of folks. So as we mentioned, we did report back right after the first meeting in September, and this is our report on the second meeting that took place in Amsterdam. And we do want to thank Microsoft for hosting there. It was a beautiful facility right near the airport, and we took full advantage of it. So quick review here. We'll just hit on highlights of about DIDs, the 4 core properties of a DID. They're persistent. They never need to change. They're resolvable, so you can look it up to discover metadata about the DID subject. They are cryptographically verifiable, so that you can prove ownership or control using cryptography. And lastly, they're decentralized. They don't require any centralized registration authority. It doesn't mean you couldn't use one, but they're not required. So Markus, you want to speak to this one on the overall structure of DIDs?
Sure. So the syntax of DIDs roughly follows from syntax that's familiar from other URIs, and in this case specifically the URNs. So the first part of a DID is the scheme. So that's the case with all types of URIs, right? Whether it's HTTP URI or URN or anything else, it always starts with the scheme, and then the next syntactical component in the DID is the so-called DID method that tells you how exactly the DID is created and resolved and updated and deactivated using a distributed ledger or some other kind of decentralized system. And then the rest is the DID method specific identifier. The syntax of that and how exactly that works depends on the method. So it's different for each method. Sometimes it's a random number, sometimes it's a hash of a public key, or something else. And this roughly, as you can see on the slide, this roughly follows the example from URNs, which also have a namespace component and then the namespace specific string. So there's some parallels there.
Exactly. Now the key to DID methods is, to DIDs is that DID methods, they define how to do the 4 CRUD operations, right? That's how you generate the DID, which is critical because it's a decentralized process for most methods. How you resolve it into a DID document, that's the read operation. Update, how you will update that if, for instance, you need to rotate your cryptographic keys. And lastly, how would you deactivate, revoke, terminate a DID so it no longer functions? It's turned off all the way. And those are the 4 things that every DID method has to define in terms of operations on a DID. And we're up to over 40 DID methods have been registered in the informal registry at W3C. And then there's the role of DID document. You want to cover this one quickly here, Markus?
Sure. So as we said, if you have a DID, then you can resolve it to a DID document following the rules of the appropriate DID method. And we're saying the DID document contains data about the DID subject. So the DID subject is identified by the DID and is described by the DID document, and in theory it could contain a lot of all kinds of information about the subject, but typically we say that the DID document should contain ideally the minimum amount of information that's needed for trusted interaction with the subject. So primarily this means public keys, so you can establish secure, encrypted and authenticated communication. Then service endpoints, so you can know what kind of protocol you can use to interact with the subject. And some other things, authentication mechanism, how do you authenticate the DID subject, and things like timestamps or delegation or authorization information, but that's more advanced. So the basic components are like the keys and the endpoints.
Exactly, and the process of getting from the DID to the DID document is called DID resolution. And we're going to talk more about this today because it was one of the key topics that we discussed at the face-to-face. Now, it does depend on the DID method. That's the whole point. It's defined by the read operation of each DID method. And every DID method can choose to do this in its own way, provided that you get to that result. Now, DID resolution is planned to be a separate specification to specifically, the whole of it is not in the scope for the DID working group, but we're going to talk about what is in scope as part of our report on the meeting. So our last slide here on the at least four categories of DIDs. We covered this again in our last roundup. Markus, you want to quickly provide some color on this?
So, yeah, I mean, this is important to know. This is not a formal list of types that's in the specification. So it's not like if you want to work on a DID method, you have to pick one of those or you have to fit it into one of these categories. These are just patterns or common properties of DID methods that we are observing as people invent new ones. And so the classic ones are based on ledgers or blockchains. DIDs on Bitcoin, DIDs on Ethereum. Those were the first types. Then the next one, peer-to-peer. Those are actually the most innovative, I would say. Those are DIDs that are not anchored on any ledger. They are not stored on a blockchain. They only exist within the context of a relationship between a limited number of parties. So there we can already see how flexible the DID concept really is, as long as it supports the basic requirements of a DID method. It can be implemented in many different ways. Where it says layer 2, this is similar to the original blockchain or DLT-based DIDs, but those add an additional storage component, such as a distributed hash table or other distributed file system, in order to basically allow for very large numbers of DIDs. So you could create or update thousands of DIDs, but you only require a single operation on the ledger, which increases performance and scalability, and it reduces costs. And then alternative, as I said, this is not a limited exhaustive list where everything has to fit in. There are many other alternative ideas also for how the DID concept can be applied.
There we go. All right, so that's enough coverage of the basics. Now let's dive into reporting on what happened in Amsterdam. There were four major topics. In fact, we'll just go and show you what the agenda looked like. We agreed on, the chairs, Brent and Dan, set up that there were the four major things we needed to talk about, and we're going to dive into each of these. And then there were additional topics that we're also going to cover a little bit more quickly at the end, because it's really these four major topics. And then actually, DID resolution, we're going to talk about that as well, because we had an important discussion about what portion of that is in scope. So let's go ahead and dive right into these first four. And we began with the question of different representations. This is a term we use for DID documents. There's been a long-standing discussion or debate, if we want to put it that way, over the different representations. And I'm going to quickly just summarize that JSON LD was that's JSON linked data, if you're not familiar with that format, which is the format, the primary format for verifiable credentials, was the previous specification that many of us worked on. And even though you don't have to use JSON-LD for it, the overall model was based on that. It is based on semantic web and RDF. Anyone can extend it, and you can make it compatible with many other systems we see here. And the tension was with developers who want to use just plain JSON as well. And we have simple examples here. And of course, JSON has many, many wonderful things about it as well. These, I don't want to call it two camps, because there's many of us that believe very much in the benefits of both of these formats. And then a third format that was increasingly getting discussion on the working group is CBOR. For developers that are familiar with it, you understand there's definitely more uses that are coming up out there, and it's quite easy to convert between JSON and CBOR. It's a more compact representation, but it's popular with IPFS and is growing uses in other things. And so all three of these were examples. They're not. This isn't comprehensive by any means, but these were three different formats or representations where we finally decided to standardize on for this. And the question was, well, what are we going to do about, is there going to be a canonical format? Are we going to support all of them? And there was a presentation given about the real issues with having these different ones. Markus, do you want to speak briefly to the points? I think it was Manu Sporny from Digital Bazaar that spoke to this.
Yeah, he spoke about incompatibilities between the different models after we explored those different models, which is what Drummond just did. And I mean, the challenge was, I think that depending on where you come from, or depending on the software stack that you're building, you typically have a natural preference for one of the formats. If you're building IoT applications, then you'll probably like CBOR. If you're working with JSON-LD verifiable credentials, or Solid, or ActivityPub, or some of these existing JSON-LD based protocols, then you have a natural preference to also use a JSON-LD based DID document. And of course, if you know JSON really well, which is perhaps the most simple format, and you're working with things like Jose or OpenID Connect, which also uses plain JSON, then you like the idea of having a JSON-based DID document. And so the realization we had at the meeting was that we probably cannot decide for just one, right? We realized we're not going to make a decision to just support one, but we actually wanted to support more than one. But then we had to think about what are the differences between those models, and here are some differences listed on a high level. Primitives, that means how do the different formats treat basic data fields like numbers or strings. For example, CBOR has a built-in data type for byte arrays, which exists neither in plain JSON nor in JSON-LD. So you would have to convert it to base 64 or something like that. So that's one level of incompatibility. Structure means that JSON, for example, is a tree-based format, whereas JSON-LD is a graph-based format in terms of how you structure the data. Canonical form means does the data format have a canonical form? Can you canonicalize it so that you can do cryptographic signatures and verify them? So some formats have that and some don't. And then extensibility also works in different ways depending on the format, and we'll go into more detail on that topic.
In fact, we will go into more detail, because that was there was already a general sense we wanted to have multiple representations, but the real issue was, all right, what do you do about extensibility and interoperability between those multiple implementations? And so we had another presentation just to dive into reviewing what are all the options we have for interop between these multiple kinds of representations. And Dan Burnett actually ran us through this, all the way from one, which is no interop, which was like, well, then why would we even be here, right? We'd just go off and do separate things. And then the second choice, well, interop on the data model so that the different representations are representing the same data. And you know, that's like a minimum level that we would do as a standard. Now we can go beyond that to a data model in basic syntax, you know, so that we get to a subset of things that are interoperable between the different formats. And then the more challenging thing is to extensibility mechanisms, and how do we do that? And then can we get all the way to an interoperable canonical form, or interoperable on cryptography, which gets to be very difficult in how you apply it to the different formats. So it was a great level setting discussion between these different, you know, the whole question of how they're going to be interoperable. And that got us focused on, all right, so what really are we after for interoperability? And we actually developed this diagram there at the in real time. Markus, do you want to talk to the three-circle model?
Yeah, well, it's your diagram, but I'll try. So the idea is that at the core of the extensibility model would be sort of static terms and static properties and features that are just built into the DID specification. So those are the things like public keys or service endpoints or authentication, very fundamental functions of the DID document that would be specified in the DID core spec itself. And then the second layer would be a registry. So a registry is a mechanism that is well known, that is maintained somehow by the working group or through some mechanism that is set up by the working group that everybody who's working with DIDs would know about. So if there was some new feature, let's say a new cryptographic algorithm or a new type of verification mechanism or a new encryption protocol or something that the community feels is so important that everybody who works with DIDs should know about, and there's a registry where this can be added. And to add something to the registry, someone will have to specify how exactly that extension works. Of course, the downside of that is that well, ideologically, it introduces an element of centralization, right? There would be a mechanism that everybody would have to go through. If you wanted to add something to a DID document, you would have to go to this registry and go through a process. And we said that's good, that's useful if we want a certain extension to be globally recognized, but that should not be the only mechanism. So it should also be possible for anyone to just add their own features and their own extensions to the core DID document functionality, and that's what we call decentralized extensions. That should also be possible.
So we had, yeah, as Markus said, we developed this diagram to sort of capture the overall discussions, and we'd spent most of the first day around these topics, sort of getting the level set. And then the second day, we said, you know, we got to make a decision. We got to start making decisions, and the question of representations extensibility is the core thing. And the chairs had arranged on the second day in the afternoon to have a boat tour of Amsterdam, which was wonderfully arranged by Yvonne, who is our W3C representative and lives in Amsterdam. So we knew we had a half a day on the second day to sort of hammer it out. And this next slide is reproduced exactly word for word what got hammered out over, I think it was about a 2-hour period leading up to lunch that day. You know, point by point, the 4 points here to get to agreement on what we were going to do around this issue of representation and interoperability. So I'll cover the first point here, and we'll back and forth. The first point is exactly what we've just said. We will not have one single representation, but define an abstract data model and can be represented at least in the 3 formats we've already covered. But there can be other representations, and we're not saying those are the only 3. We're actually inviting anyone, obviously on the working group or that cares enough about another format to bring it before the working group so that we can consider that and decide will that go into the core spec. We said to make it really clear, we will actually make sure there's a graphical depiction of the abstract data model, most likely in UML diagrams. And what really sort of cemented it is to say, we need to define the formats and how you produce and consume them in such a way that you can do lossless conversion between each of those syntaxes, representations, modulo the signatures and verification, which end up being specific how it's applied to each format. So getting to that point, which we got to at about, I think, 11:30 on that day, after about, I don't know, at least an hour of discussion on this one point, was a key turning point. It was like this collective breath of, okay, now we can start to line up other things. So Markus, you want to speak to the second point?
Right. So I agree. The first one was an important breakthrough to separate the abstract data model from a number of concrete representations, and the second point was an equally important breakthrough. I would say it does have some carefully crafted diplomatic language that leaves a bit of room for interpretation. So it says, in general, the registry mechanism is the one that will be used for globally interoperable extensions. So like we said before, if somebody wanted to extend the DID document in a way that is visible to the entire community and that enables interoperability between all the DID implementations and applications and services and so on, then a registry is a useful tool or the preferred mechanism for doing that. But at the same time, this doesn't really rule out any other kinds of extensions that people wanted to make in their specific usage of DID documents, but other kinds of extensibility mechanisms will probably not have the same kind of globally interoperable nature. So it's so the registry is equally important for extensibility as it is for interoperability. These things go together.
Right. And the third one about which there was complete consensus after we discussed it is that the W3C is in the process, I think near the end of a process of defining how it will maintain registries, because there are more and more specs at W3C that need registries, and you don't want to necessarily have to push all that work to other standards bodies like IANA. So a number of us attended at the face-to-face meeting in Fukuoka in August, the session where they were defining how registry mechanisms are defined in specs, and we took in that information and said that's exactly what we need to do. So we all agreed we will define the registry mechanism in the spec such that it can be implemented, while the working group is going, and then continue after that, after the working group is finished, and be maintained by the W3C according to the governance that we define. And that took us down to the last one about basically how registry entries will be guided. You want to cover that one, Markus?
Yeah, so it basically says a new entry into the registry is a new feature or new field that somebody wanted to add to the document that can be added to the registry. And if you do that, you have to provide a specification. So a specification that explains obviously how that new field or entry will work. So that's a pretty common mechanism. That's something we've seen in a number of IETF specifications, like the Jose stack, for example. But what's new here is that in addition to a specification, you also need to provide a valid JSON LD context. So without going too much into the technical details, that's essentially what enables lossless conversion between a plain JSON representation of a DID document and a JSON LD representation of the DID document, and that was one of the main objectives, or one of the topics that we've been working on for a few weeks. How can we support both plain JSON and JSON-LD without really losing anything? And this seems to be a good mechanism.
Yeah, and as a result, you know, our conclusions, our takeaways here, and this is, you know, felt broadly. We had another, you know, day and a half to discuss this, but we're happy with the consensus we, you know, reached about abstract data model, multiple representations, with the key being lossless round trip conversion between all of them, so that there really are, you know, the specifics that are there that are necessary to get the real interop are going to be specified and be very testable, and that there will be the centralized registry mechanism that Markus just described, while still supporting decentralized extensibility, so we can have innovation at the edges, and you know, and pressure, or when something proves to be an innovation that is, you know, that should be widely interoperable, that can result in pressure to bring it into the registry. And lastly, that was obvious that DID core spec needed to be restructured to reflect that. And I have a slide here that that basically quickly shows you the current structure of the spec on the left and the new one on the right. And there's not, as you can see, really large differences, but it's going to be much richer in terms of the data model being defined abstractly, and then the considerations for extensibility, and then the requirements for each representation. And again, that the JSON, LD, and CBOR may not be the only representations. We may have, again, possibly additional ones that go in the core spec, and we can always have additional ones that can be defined independently later that meet the representation requirements here. And then we've added the registry governance section that we'll be putting in separately, and around resolvers and that, we'll talk about that more in one of the following sections. So anything else you want to say about this, Markus?
No, I think, well, except that maybe we would also use registries for other things like DID methods or matrix parameters. But let's see.
Yes, very good point. The more we talked about them, the more we said the registry mechanism could be useful for all of those things, you know, and really help support interoperability all around. So pretty strong consensus around that. All right, so our third major topic was metadata, and that's a very broad issue. That it very generally is about what belongs in a DID document versus what belongs, you know, outside of it. And Markus is someone who's been driving the work on DID resolution, has been very close to this issue for a good long time. Markus, maybe you want to speak to these different questions around metadata?
Yeah, I mean, basically the origin of this topic is that we used to have a property in the DID document that's called created, right? And everybody was fine with that, but at some point it turned out that different people had different interpretations of what exactly that meant. Does it mean when did the controller of the DID document register the DID, or is it a timestamp from the ledger when the DID document was anchored, or is it a timestamp when the DID document was returned by a resolver to a client, or is it a timestamp about when the DID subject was created? So, for example, if the DID subject is a teapot, then is it a timestamp of when that teapot was created? And so we started to think more thoroughly about all these different fields and properties, and some of them are method specific, some are universal, and then we started to think about, do they all belong into a DID document, or should some of these properties be metadata about the DID document and belong elsewhere? And then these are some of the some of the open questions. I think that the most important one was the last one. Where do these pieces of data belong? Yeah, what metadata belongs in the resolution result or a DID document, or even in some third category.
Exactly. So
for a while we couldn't even agree among everyone of what the categories should be before even talking about the individual properties, and that led to this approach that you're showing now.
Yes, which I have to again credit the chairs for innovative suggestion that rather than trying to continue to argue about the categories of metadata, they suggested taking a bottom-up approach, and we did take about 90 minutes, and all we did was have working group members propose the types of data they wanted, regardless of where it came from or where it was going, so we could just get that. Now the next slide is it's literally the first of 9 slides that we ended up creating just recording this, and you can see we put unnamed because we wanted to make it clear we didn't want to rat hole on what to name any particular proposed piece of data or property. We just wanted, what was it about? What is it used for? Where did it come from? And who was it that proposed it? So we knew who to go back to. The full slide deck for the meeting has, again, 9 of these slides. And this is just the timestamp is the one that Markus brought up initially, so we started with that, but then we just let people go, and we ended up with, let's see, what was it, 26 properties that got consolidated into a Google Doc. That's it's publicly available there, and we're going to continue to use that to list all the properties, and then we'll tackle the job of deciding, all right, where do they belong? Any other conclusions you want to share about the metadata discussion, Markus?
My sense is that probably we will end up with 3 buckets. The document, which contains data about the subject, about the individual organization or thing that is identified by the DID. Then I think we will have metadata about the DID document, and then I think we will have metadata about the specific resolution process. So if I resolve a DID and then a bit later Drummond resolves the same DID, then hopefully the DID document will be the same, the metadata about the DID document will be the same, but the metadata about the resolution process may be different because Drummond and I will resolve something at different times. We may be using different resolvers. So I think we'll have these 3 buckets, but it's a discussion that is still ongoing.
There you go. All right. So that takes us to the last of the 4 major topics. And I know it's Markus's favorite topic, matrix parameters, for which he started with this slide. Want to explain this one, Markus?
Such an inspiring and cool term, right? Matrix parameters. That sounds very very important. But yeah, here you can see what it looks like, right? So it's a syntactical component of what we call a DDRL. DDRL is a DID plus some of the familiar syntactical components like path or query and fragment that we also know from HTTP URLs. But in addition to that, we have matrix parameters, which are strictly speaking a part of the authority component of the URI. And basically, we had a discussion at the face-to-face meeting whether we want them and what they are used for, or whether they are perhaps too complex and not necessary. So we went over specifically one use case, but also some others that where matrix parameters can help.
And Markus, you showed you ran through this section and talked about the DID-based PURLs, persistent URLs.
Yes, so it would take quite some time to go over that in detail, but basically you can, there are 2 important concepts in fundamental web architecture. So this is not just about verifiable credentials or authentication or things that we usually associate with DIDs, but it's really about building a new foundational building block for the web itself. And there are these two important functions or concepts in web architecture. One is web linking, which means that the web consists of resources that can link to each other, right? Web pages that are connected through links. And the second concept is so-called PURLs, permanent URLs, URLs that don't change, that are persistent identifiers, just like DIDs. But the concept of a permanent URL is older than DIDs. There's even a Wikipedia page about that. So we think that with DIDs we can create these stable permanent URLs that remain, that are persistent, that don't change if the underlying location of a resource changes. So in this example, you could imagine this URL points to a resume, a personal CV, and it has some other components in the URL. And yeah, on this slide on the bottom, you can see that over time the same DID URL can at one point in time be dereferenced to one HTTP URL, to one concrete network location, and at a later point in time it could redirect or be dereferenced to a different HTTP network location. So this enables portability. If I move resources on the web from one place to the other, then I just need to update my DID document, but my DID URL does not change after I move resources. And in order to do that, in order to construct the DID URL that enables this, we introduced a matrix parameter called service, which selects one of the services from the DID document, but then still leaves the path and the query and the fragment free and open for the user or for the developer, right? We don't want to define special path or special query strings in the DID specification, just like the HTTP specification doesn't tell you what path or query you may want in your URL namespace.
Exactly. Now we Markus just talked about one of the most common, the service parameter there. This is a list of the other ones that he covered and we discussed briefly there. We've only got about 15 minutes left, so we won't go deep down into these others. We did cover some of these in that previous our first DID report. So in terms of conclusions about this, we didn't actually close on this. Everyone felt like, okay, we're getting a better sense. There is still 2 points of view. The semicolon syntax you've been seeing here that go in what's called the higher part of the DID URL, also sometimes called the authority component, or there is a contingent arguing, oh, they should be namespace query parameters like some other protocols use. And we have these other open questions, but everyone was confident that Markus will come to the right decision here soon, right, Markus?
Well, I will say that I think there was consensus that this use case of portable web resources is desirable, and that it's a very useful tool for that, and that we should support that. The question that still needs some more discussion is just whether matrix parameters are the right or the only way to do that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really reflect that here. All right, well, we have about 15 minutes left. So the other sort of major topic we discussed was this question of the overlap of the main spec with DID resolution and sort of where the line needed to be drawn. So Markus and I made this list of sort of the major questions that we discussed. We had about 45-minute discussion of this. Again, Markus leads much of the work there. It's a separate call just on DID resolution. So Markus, you want to briefly expound on these questions?
Yeah, it's just an experience that we often have, that a lot of the topics that we talk about in the DID working group are directly touching on DID resolution somehow. It's hard to talk about the different representations, JSON or JSON-LD, if you don't also talk about how does the resolver behave and which format does it return. at what point in time, and also the metadata discussion, right? Some data is about the DID document, some data is about the resolver, so it's very closely connected, and even the matrix parameters. The matrix parameters are direct options or parameters that need to be interpreted by the resolver, so there's constant overlap. And right now, as Drummond said, there's a separate DID resolution specification, and the boundary is not so clear. And so the insight that we had last week at the meeting was that probably it would make sense still to have these two specifications. They would still both exist, but in the DID core specification, we should at least very clearly define what's here called the resolution contract. So the exact interface, what's the input to the resolver or the resolving function, and what's the output. This kind of interface should be in the DID core spec, and then the DID resolution spec would go into detail of how exactly that is implemented.
Bingo. And that's the primary conclusion there, and one that I think everyone felt good about, because it helped us understand where that line should be, and therefore what should be in the DID core spec. So that was, again, another, I think, quite positive conclusion. I think everyone felt good about that. And so we'll, again, to leave time for questions, let's aim, Markus, and see if we can get through this final part in, say, another 7-8 minutes, and we'll leave ourselves a time for Q&A, because we could talk quite a bit about all these other topics. We'll just pop through them quickly. Brent did a presentation on security concerns. Obviously, you know, what we're doing with DIDs, the fact that cryptographically verifiable identifiers that will be in many cases, not the only case, but in many cases being used as the authoritative way to determine the public key or public keys or other cryptographic verification methods associated with any DID. This is PKI, public key infrastructure writ large. And so it's security concerns are really, you know, front and center. We could talk for a great period of time. Markus, is there anything else you want to say about this one?
No, just it was the first session, right? So to get everybody aligned on how important this is.
Yeah, and keeping us aligned on it. So that's not going to. These were a series of suggestions that we put together to talk about. And one thing there was universal agreement on was there's always a security consideration section as well as privacy in any W3C spec, but we're going to actually put pointers to that section, cross-references heavily throughout the whole spec, so that you just can't miss the fact that this is deeply a security based specification. Another excellent presentation by Sam Smith on the Internet of Things. Oh, I didn't realize this was, I'm going to click through this, Markus, as you maybe say a few things about it.
Yeah, I think this session was useful, I think, because IoT comes up a lot in the context of DIDs, as some people think it's going to be by large the biggest application of DIDs. At the same time, not everybody is an expert on that, and many people don't really know what's going on. So I think that's what that was the purpose of the session. The main insight I remember from Sam's session about IoT was that there are just going to be so many devices, such large amounts of things that are networked, and that each need their own identifiers, and that you will not be able to manage them all centrally in the cloud. There's just not enough processing power and memory available to provision and manage them all in a cloud system. So you have to put identification, you have to push identification and data processing to the edge, right? So these devices, they need to manage themselves or communicate with each other in a peer-to-peer fashion as much as possible, and that's why DIDs as decentralized identifiers also could help a lot.
Yeah, it's a very deep topic about which I think there's going to be some additional There already have been SSI meetup webinars and more coming. So I expect we'll be talking about this for quite a while. All right, so there were two more sessions, each devoted to other documents that are part of the DID Working Group Charter. One of them is the Rubric for decentralization. This is being led by Joe Andrew. And we're just going to very quickly, since this again could be another whole webinar, show you his three of his slides here that talk about. This is a document that helps provide a guideline, a set of has a method of evaluation for something. They're used in education quite a bit. We said we need one for defining this very squishy concept of decentralization. And that's what a subgroup of the TC has been, of the working group has been working on. Both Markus and I are contributors to this. And it's moving along very nicely. It is, we had a good discussion about, sort of where it was and how much more work will be necessary on it. And if you're interested in that document, we included, looks like it wrapped here just slightly, but anyway, that's in the slide deck. You'll be able to go and take a look. Appreciate your feedback. Markus, anything else you want to say about the rubric?
Just that it's used to evaluate decentralization of DID methods, but it's not designed to come up with an absolute score, right? So there's not going to be a ranking of what are the best or the most decentralized DID methods, but it's rather a tool that everyone can use for themselves to evaluate DID methods and how useful they are from a specific point of view, right? So there's not an absolute measure of what's more decentralized than something else, but it's rather for finding out whether a certain DID method is decentralized enough for for my requirements.
Yeah, for everyone's specific environment or requirements. Yeah. That's the whole point. You have to look at it yourself. So Joe and Phil Archer from GS1 also led. There's another document which we're putting out called Use Case and Requirements. And yes, you think this is part of what pretty much every technical working group does, but it's particularly important here because the uses for DIDs are very broad and in many cases, however, still very specific. So there are 5 right now. I think they call them primary use cases. You can see listed here, but there's then going to be a whole bunch of additional ones. And Joe and Phil were inviting the rest of the technical of the working group to submit these in this format, and anyone listening to this who's involved with the technical with the working group or that just wants to make sure that your use case is considered, just one paragraph is needed in following this form. Contact anyone in the working group or submit it as an issue. You can do that publicly even if you're not part of the working group. So anything else about use cases, Markus?
Yeah, just that this is not only meant to be some additional interesting information, but this is actually the source, sort of the basis for the technical content of the specification. So sometimes when we have some controversial issue, when we talk about different representations or matrix parameters or some feature, and people have different opinions on whether and how it should be supported, then we usually point to the use cases, right? If there's no use case that requires a certain feature, then it's hard to argue why that feature should exist. So there's a direct link between this and the actual spec work.
Exactly. They're always super helpful that way. All right, we wanted to just, we're not going to say anything about these, but just point out that there were 2 other presentations given that we just think have some fabulous content in them. Christopher Allen gave one on self-sovereign identity, why are we here? Which I think he's going to have at least part of that. I suggested, Christopher, you got to give that as an SSI meetup webinar, and I think that'll be coming up hopefully relatively soon. And Brent did one on anonymous credentials, which I think has already been the subject of how ZKP really works to provide that function. So there's the URLs to both of those. They're again publicly available. And so we'll wrap up here just with this overall takeaway slide and leave a few minutes for questions. Again, from my perspective, it was a very successful meeting. We reached alignment around these 3 points that we've talked about. And while we didn't close on the other open issues, I personally feel that they're manageable and that we got to a good sense of where the line should be on the resolution contract. And now there's a lot of hard work in front of us, but I'm confident that Markus can get it all done.
Sure. One thing about these 2 additional presentations by Christopher, Alan, and Brent. So the first one, Christopher's presentation was very political, philosophical, and Brent's presentation was very low level, technical, mathematical, but they were both very effective at reminding us that what we're doing here will really have an important impact on people's lives. So I recommend both of them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Markus, any other final takeaway before we jump over to questions?
No, I think that's good. I agree. It was a very productive meeting, but let's not lean back and let's keep in mind that a lot of work is still ahead of us.
Yeah, exactly. The chair's actually, I guess it's traditional to take the week off afterwards. And I thought that was wonderful, except for Markus and I signed up not just for this, but for the the next webinar we're going to do on the DID chapter in the self-sovereign identity book. So we're still there. So anyway, Alex, over to you. Questions that may have been.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you. We have 4 questions here. Just going to start with the first one, which I think is easy. Dan, he's asking, how are DIDs made globally unique? I don't know if you want to briefly give some background about this, or if you want to talk about it in the next webinar we have in 60 minutes, because that's where you will be talking about it. But maybe you want to give a quick shot about this.
Yeah, the very short answer to that is the DID scheme is going to be registered with IANA, so it's a URI scheme, and then every namespace, every DID method name needs to be unique, and then within the method, so whatever method you define against whatever what we call verifiable data registry, be it a blockchain or distributed database or whatever, your method needs to say how the identifiers in your namespace are all unique. And for instance, some of the Ethereum methods use an address on the Ethereum blockchain. Some of them are based on a part of the public key in a key pair. The sovereign method uses half of a 256-bit verification key. So all of the methods are required to say how they produce their own globally unique string, and then it's globally unique inside their namespace, inside the DID namespace.
And Dan is also asking, commenting, TC307 is covering use cases as well. Dozens are locked. So yeah, this is for your information. I guess I don't know TC307, but you might know it. If not, we can ask Dan to comment more about it.
Yeah, that would be great. There certainly are use cases and other parallel efforts that we should make sure are referenced or covered here.
Awesome. Dan, maybe you can comment this a little bit in the question tool, and I'll bring it up just to share it with Markus and Drummond. Next one is from Michelle. Michelle is saying, registry governance, can you elaborate a little on what this will cover?
Oh, that's such a great question. The W3C has been working on it. I think they're, I don't know if they're publicly available, but there's essentially a registry specification that they're working on. I don't know if they're going to call it a spec or guidelines or whatever, that basically are the requirements of a working group if it wants to specify a registry. And obviously you need to specify what information goes in the registry. And in our case, we would turn around and say, well, we want to have DID methods, DID properties, specific service types, specific public key types, potentially even different representations if you're going to extend it that way. So you have to specify those things, and then you have to specify the governance of the registry. Who is going to maintain it? What are the rules for or policies for making new entries, right? What requirements do they have to meet? For instance, one of our rules everyone's been talking about is if you want to make an entry, you have to have a specification to go with it. It doesn't have to be through a standards development organization, but you have to have a publicly available specification that describes the service or the property or the cryptographic algorithm, for example. And then even also, long-term maintenance. Where will it reside? How will it be maintained? That's part of what W3C is putting together. Any other thoughts on that, Markus?
Well, I think that's right. There will be some very basic rules. For example, you should not add anything to the registry if there is already something else that kind of does what you're proposing, and just some simple sanity checks like that. But in general, I think anybody who wants to propose something that is documented and implementable can add something.
Yeah,
awesome.
There are some similar registries out there that make pretty good precedents for this. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, just then we have Dan. He's just saying, yeah, this is ISO TC 307 and the working group 6 is covering use cases. I shared this with both of you, Markus and Drummond, in Slack. So you have that info. Then final question we have, just because I'm conscious that Drummond has to go in a minute, is Fabian. He's asking, where do you see the biggest need for entrepreneurial initiative in order to push the use of DIDs and SSI in general in practice?
Oh, that's such a great question. Nice, big, broad one there. There are DIDs, and we'll talk about this in the next webinar. They're such a fundamental building block of, what you could call it Web 3.0 or the D-Web or the next generation of the web, that I think there will be many businesses built on them, similar to how there are many businesses built on URLs today, right? They power search engines and auction sites and e-commerce sites, and we'll just see many new businesses built on them. So I think it's a very broad brush for entrepreneurs, and one that I know that many entrepreneurs that I talk to are very excited about. Markus being one of them.
I would just say these are a low-level component of an entire stack of SSI, right? There's even some diagram somewhere that happened at the Internet Identity Workshop of the SSI stack, and there will be entrepreneurial needs and opportunities on each level of the stack. But since the DIDs are at the lowest level of the stack, they have to work really well, right? Because everything has to depend on those. So the community will definitely need stable and mature and secure and really well working DID infrastructure tools, resolvers, tools for working with DIDs, for managing them. So there will be a lot of need for that, I think.
I'll close with one prediction that I have absolute confidence in. I'd say within the next 2 years there will be some entrepreneurial use of DIDs that none of us thought about, and that will be widely considered revolutionary and get great adoption. It's just we just don't know exactly what will be done here or what will be possible with this new kind of building block, but I'm very confident it will be very unique and very powerful.
Wonderful. Drummond, if you go to the final slide, so we have some closing comments. All of you, if you want to continue with your DID marathon, join us in 55 minutes, again, with Drummond and Markus. They're both co-authors of the Self-Sovereign Identity book that will be coming out this summer or later this year, which is available right now with Manning in the MEEP edition. MEEP means the Manning Early Access Program, where you can read part 1 and part 2 of the book, and specifically Drummond and Markus have written the DID chapter, which is the most amazing chapter I've read about DIDs. I think they really make it super clear, and I doubt that most people had the opportunity to have that deep level of understanding. And what we will be covering in 55 minutes is those basics. Basically, Drummond and Markus will share the deep insights about DIDs, and it helped me personally a lot. I'm really proud to be able to work with Markus and Drummond and many other of the leading thought leaders about self-sovereign identity for this book. And this is a special book session we will do for DIDs. We will do many more because we have chapters for everything related to DID. So during the year, we'll cover many more of these. So join us in about 55 minutes. Also, for everyone, if you cannot join us, if you want to watch the recording later, we have a couple of webinars coming up. We have Tim Bomer to talk about identity and money. We're on the 25th of February this year. Now, in a couple of weeks, we have eStatus from Germany who will be talking about the SSI ecosystem they're developing there. We have John Phillips from Australia talking on the 28th about a great video he did about SSI to explain it and make it understandable for everyone. So this is stuff coming up this month. And the link, Michelle is asking, what is the link to join the next webinar in 55 minutes? Just go to ssimeetup.org. You will see webinar 46, and there you have the link. And that's the quickest way to check it out. Drummond and Markus, thank you so much for everything. Thank you so much for the second DID report, which I think makes it really accessible and democratic for everyone to learn about this stuff. And we will talk again in 55 minutes to deep dive into DIDs.
All right, the DID Marathon. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Markus.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.